The notebook was soaking wet. That was the first thing Deputy Marine Patrol Officer Ray Coulter noticed when he climbed aboard the Hazel Dawn at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in January. The 34-foot lobster vessel had drifted into a shallow cove just south of Cutler, Maine, its engine idling, its running lights still burning amber in the gray pre-dawn air. No one was at the helm. No one was on deck. The coffee mug on the console was still warm. And on the captain's bench, wedged beneath a coil of rope as though someone had placed it there deliberately, almost carefully, was a water-stained composition notebook. Black cover. Worn corners. The kind you buy at a pharmacy for $2. Coulter pulled on latex gloves before touching it. He would later say he wasn't sure why he did that. It was instinct. Something about the scene made him feel that he was standing inside a question he wasn't ready to answer. He opened to the last written page. The final entry was dated 3 days earlier. The handwriting was calm, almost peaceful, and the last sentence read, "Whatever happens out here, I need you to know I was not afraid. If you are here for the first time, help me show that these tales matter by subscribing to this channel." Now let's continue. To understand what happened to Chester Renner, the man who would vanish from that boat, you have to understand what it means to be a working fisherman on the coast of Down East Maine. This is not a glamorous life. It never has been. The rocky stretch of coastline between Lubec and Cutler, in Washington County, is one of the most remote and punishing marine environments on the entire eastern seaboard of the United States. The tides here rise and fall by as much as 24 feet. Some of the most extreme tidal swings in the world outside of the Bay of Fundy, which is just across the Canadian border. The coastal area has strong tidal current activity that makes navigation treacherous even for experienced mariners. The water temperature in January hovers just above freezing. A person who goes overboard without a survival suit has, on average, less than 15 minutes before hypothermia sets in with enough severity to prevent them from helping themselves. Chester Renner knew all of this. He had known it since he was 9 years old, when his father first put him on a boat. Chester was 58 when he disappeared. He had spent 4 decades on these waters. He was the kind of man that a small community builds its sense of safety around, the fisherman who others call when the fog comes in too thick, who knows the tidal channels by feel, who can read the color of the water the way a doctor reads a patient's face. He kept his boat in exceptional condition. He paid his fuel tabs on time. He had, in the words of his neighbor Linda Marsh, never once in 40 years missed a tide he intended to keep. His daughter, Elise Renner, was 32 years old and living in Portland when she got the call. She had spoken to her father the evening before he went out. "He sounded fine," she would later tell investigators. "He sounded completely normal. He talked about the weather. He said the forecast looked decent enough. He said he'd be back by 3. He was not back by 3. By 5 that afternoon, Elise had called his cell phone 11 times. The calls went straight to voicemail, which on its own was not alarming. Cell service along that stretch of coast is inconsistent at best, swallowed whole by the same rocky cliffs that have been swallowing ships since the colonial era. But Chester had a rule he followed without exception. If he was running late, he called. He always called. The Maine Marine Patrol received the report at 6:58 p.m. When a vessel is reported overdue, the Coast Guard deploys motor lifeboats, helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft, and fast response cutters. Multiple agencies coordinate: the Coast Guard, Maine Marine Patrol, Canadian Coast Guard, and the Maine Forestry Service. On a good night, with calm seas and clear visibility, that kind of coordinated response can cover enormous ground quickly. A good night, however, was not what they were dealing with. The search for Chester Renner launched in near-zero visibility. A thick January fog had rolled in off the Bay of Fundy at dusk, the kind that doesn't lift at dawn but instead sits on the water like a held breath. Conditions worsened rapidly. The wind picked up, waves grew larger. 6 by midnight, the search coordinator at Sector Northern New England had made the call to scale back maritime operations until conditions improved. Aircraft couldn't fly low enough to be useful. Boats were running by radar alone in water that punishes navigational errors without mercy. The searchers were looking for a man. They found instead a boat. The Hazel Dawn was spotted by a lobsterman named Gerald Poulin at first light on Wednesday morning. He had been heading out early to check his traps when he noticed the vessel drifting toward the rocks near Moose Cove. He recognized it immediately. He had fished alongside Chester Renner for 20 years. The lights were on, Poulin said. Engine was running, but there was nobody there. I called out. I called his name 3-4 times. Nothing. He radioed the Marine Patrol. By the time Deputy Coulter arrived on scene, the boat had drifted into the shallows and grounded softly on a sandbar, almost gently, as if it had decided to stop on its own. The coffee mug was still warm. The trap buoys were still stacked on deck, ready to be set. A pair of rubber gloves lay on the gunwale in the position of a man who had just pulled them off. Chester's cell phone was in the cabin, fully charged, 7 unanswered calls from Elise visible on the screen, and on the bench the journal. When a Maine fisherman's boat is found with no one aboard, running on its own, it sets off a particular kind of fear in a coastal community, one that is entirely distinct from a simple boating accident. It raises a question that searchers do not want to ask but cannot avoid. Where did he go? The notebook contained 64 pages of writing. According to investigators, Chester Renner had been keeping the journal for approximately 3 years. It was not a logbook. It wasn't a record of catches or weather patterns or boat maintenance. It was something closer to a personal diary, written in the unhurried, deliberate prose of a man who chose his words carefully. The early entries were quiet, domestic. He wrote about Elise's childhood, about the house he'd built with his own hands on a hillside outside South Addison, about his wife, Carol, who had passed away from cancer 6 years before, and how, on bad days on the water, he still talked to her. He described the way the light falls on the Atlantic in October like nothing else in the world. He wrote about his dog, a shepherd mix named Pilot, who waited on the dock for him every evening. But somewhere around page 40, the tone of the journal shifted. The entries became shorter. The handwriting, which had been loose and easy in the early pages, grew smaller, more controlled. Investigators noted that Chester had begun to write about the water differently, not as a place he worked but as a place that was speaking to him. He wrote about sounds he heard on the water at night that he could not identify. He wrote about a recurring sensation of being followed, which he himself acknowledged might be nothing but the isolation playing tricks on an aging man's mind. He wrote, 40 years on this water and I am only now starting to understand that I do not know it at all. And then, in the final weeks of entries, something else appeared. Chester had begun writing about another vessel. He first mentioned it on a Tuesday in late December. He had been hauling traps near Moose Cove, the same stretch of water where his own boat would later be found, when he noticed a vessel anchored approximately a quarter-mile offshore. It was too far out to identify clearly, and the fog had been thick that morning. He noted that it appeared to be a trawler of some kind, older, dark-hulled. He thought nothing of it. Boats anchor in these waters all the time, but he saw it again 3 days later, in a slightly different position, but in the same general area. This time, he noted that it appeared to be unoccupied. No one on deck, no visible crew activity. He wrote, "Funny place to anchor for that long with no gear in the water." He saw it a third time on the last day of the year. This time he motored closer. He estimated he got within 200 yards before the vessel, without any visible warning, without the sound of an engine starting, simply began to move. It headed northeast toward the Canadian border at a speed that surprised him. He tried to read the vessel's name, but the stern was toward him and the light was wrong. He wrote, "Don't know what that boat is doing out here, but I intend to find out." The next entry was dated 5 days later. He had asked around at the dock in Cutler. Nobody he talked to recognized the description. The harbormaster had no record of any vessel matching that description filing an anchorage in that area. A friend who worked with the Maine Marine Patrol said he'd checked the registry. The friend never got back to him before Chester vanished. The loss of a fisherman underscores the dangers inherent in commercial fishing on the Maine coast. Fishing vessels are vulnerable to capsizing even in relatively calm weather if their gear gets caught on the ocean floor. Tragically, the waters off this section of Maine have claimed lives before. South Addison is not a large community. It never has been. It is the kind of place where the volunteer fire department is run by a man who also sells bait out of his garage, where the post office closes at noon on Fridays, where 3 generations of the same family might fish the same ledge year after year, passing down the knowledge of the water the way other families pass down jewelry or land. In a community like that, the disappearance of a man like Chester Renner is not just a tragedy. It is a rupture. Close friends describe Chester as an incredibly respected member of the community, always ready with a joke and willing to help neighbors. His neighbor Chris Beal, who had known Chester for more than 25 years, spent the first 48 hours of the search on his own boat, scanning the shoreline between Cutler and Eastport, calling out Chester's name into the fog. "I kept thinking I was going to see him on a rock somewhere," Beal said. "Wet, cold, maybe hurt, but alive. Chester's the kind of man you don't picture being gone. You just can't picture it." The Marine Patrol brought in additional resources. The Coast Guard coordinated search efforts with multiple agencies, and rescue crews searched more than 950 square miles of ocean and coastline, covering more than 42 combined hours over the first weekend. Fishermen with their own sonar equipment fanned out across the cove and the surrounding waters, looking for anything: a body, debris, a sign. Elise Renner drove up from Portland the same night she heard the news. She arrived at the dock before dawn and stood in the cold dark and watched the search boats move across the black water, their lights sweeping back and forth like slow, tired eyes. She had brought Chester's dog, Pilot, with her. The shepherd stood at the edge of the dock and stared at the water without moving. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He just waited. When a man goes missing from a boat that shows no signs of mechanical failure, no distress call, no sign of struggle, investigators face a problem that is both practical and deeply unsettling. What happened? The Coast Guard search and rescue coordinators noted that in cases of fishermen missing without distress signals, the lack of a mayday call is among the most confounding elements, because experienced mariners almost always call if they have any opportunity to do so. Chester Renner had a working radio. It had been tested. The Marine Patrol confirmed it was functional when they boarded the Hazel Dawn. His cell phone was charged. His emergency position indicating radio beacon, the device that automatically transmits a location signal when it hits salt water, had not activated, which meant it had never gone in the water, or at least Chester hadn't. The coffee mug suggested he had been at the helm recently. The position of the rubber gloves suggested he had been working on deck. The engine running suggested he had not planned to stop. But stop he had. Investigators read the journal carefully. The Marine Patrol forwarded the entries about the unidentified trawler to the Coast Guard's Intelligence Division. They also contacted the Canadian Coast Guard, given the proximity of the search area to the border, and asked whether any unregistered vessels had been noted in the region in recent weeks. The answer they received was careful and measured, possibly. There had been some radio traffic on irregular frequencies monitored in the region over the previous month. Nothing conclusive. Nothing that rose to the level of a formal report. But possibly, the journal's final entry, the one that read, "Whatever happens out here, I need you to know I was not afraid," created its own difficulty. It was addressed to no one by name. Could have been addressed to Elise. Could have been addressed to Carol, his late wife. It could have been written in that particular mood of lonely reflection that comes to solitary people on cold, dark water in the middle of winter. Or it could have been written by a man who believed, with some certainty, that something was coming. Maine's coast has been taking fishermen for as long as fishermen have worked it. In the summer of 2023, 18-year-old Tyler Michaud left the dock near Petit Manin Island to haul his lobster traps. He was fishing 300 traps alone, saving money for the Maine Maritime Academy, where he had a place waiting for him in the fall. That evening, another fisherman found his boat, still in gear, empty, drifting in the fog. Tyler was never found. In January of 2025, Chester Barrett, 67, and his son Aaron Barrett, 29, set out aboard their scallop dragger in Cobscook Bay, the same waters where Chester Renner worked. They changed course due to deteriorating sea conditions. They never arrived at their destination. Their boat, Sudden Impact, was eventually located 160 feet below the surface near Moose Cove, in the same stretch of Washington County coastline. Divers who traveled from 5 different states recovered the body of Chester Barrett from inside the vessel's cabin. Aaron Barrett was never found. These are not rare stories in down East Maine. They are the stories the coast repeats, season after season, in different voices with different names, but with the same terrible ending. A boat comes back, and the man does not. What made Chester Renner's case different, what made investigators and the community hold their collective breath just a little longer than they might otherwise have, was the journal. Every other case had an explanation, even when that explanation was heartbreaking. A wave, a mechanical failure, a moment of inattention on a deck made slick with ice and spray. Chester Renner's boat showed none of those things. His boat came back intact, running, lit, warm, as if he had simply stepped off the edge of the world between one breath and the next. Elise Renner is a practical woman. She is an accountant by profession and describes herself, with a slight and sad smile, as a person who requires evidence before she forms a conclusion. She is not given to superstition. She does not believe in ghosts. But she had read her father's journal by the second morning of the search, and she had reached a conclusion that she held quietly, for a long time, before she spoke it aloud to anyone. She believed her father had gone willingly to that other boat, not under threat, not by accident, but on purpose. "My dad was not a reckless man," she told the Marine Patrol investigator assigned to the case. "If he wrote about that boat 3 times in a journal he never intended anyone else to read, then it was sitting heavy on him. My dad did not let things sit. He acted on them." She believed Chester had, on the morning of his disappearance, motored toward the unidentified trawler for a closer look. She believed something had happened during that approach, a mechanical issue, a misjudgment, an encounter gone wrong, that had put him in the water. What she could not explain was why the Hazel Dawn had then returned to the cove on its own. The boat had not been set to autopilot. The course she took back to shore was not a straight line. It had curved, as if steered, before the engine was apparently left in idle. A drifting engine does not steer a curve. The Marine Patrol investigator wrote that detail down and underlined it twice. Suspending a search and rescue mission is described by Coast Guard commanders as one of the hardest decisions they make. They conduct every mission with the hope of returning missing people to safety. When exhaustive search efforts covering hundreds of square miles turn up nothing, there comes a point when the mathematics of survival become irrefutable. For Chester Renner, that point came on the 5th day. The announcement was made on a Friday afternoon. The Coast Guard had covered the search area multiple times. The Marine Patrol had continued its efforts beyond the Coast Guard's suspension. Local fishermen, men who knew every ledge, every current, every likely drift pattern in those waters, had run their own boats in grid patterns across the cove and the surrounding coastline. Nothing. At the dock in Cutler that evening, a group of fishermen gathered the way fishermen do after a loss, not with much speech but with presence. They stood together and looked at the water. One of the older men, a lobsterman named Dale Prout who had fished with Chester for 30 years, said quietly that the ocean does not always give back what it takes. "Sometimes it keeps a thing," he said. "That's just the nature of it." Elise stood at the edge of the dock with Pilot beside her. The dog pressed against her leg. She put her hand on his head. She didn't cry. Not there, not in front of the boats and the water and the gray winter sky. She saved that for later, in the car, alone, with the heater running and the engine off and the dark pressing against the windows. The journal was returned to Elise 6 weeks after her father's disappearance, after investigators had photographed every page and forwarded the relevant entries to the appropriate agencies. She read it again. All of it. Slowly this time, without urgency. She read about her own childhood as seen through her father's eyes. The day she caught her first fish, which she had entirely forgotten. The morning she drove away to college in a car packed with everything she owned, and Chester had stood in the driveway and watched until she turned the corner and he could no longer see her. She had not known, until she read those pages, that he had written about that moment. She had not known that he had stood there for another 15 minutes after she left. She read about Carol, about the particular silence that a house holds after the person who filled it is gone, about the way Chester had come to understand, slowly and reluctantly, that the water was the only place where that silence felt like company rather than absence. She read, again, about the dark-hulled trawler on the cove, about the sounds at night, about the last entry and its calm, final sentence. And she allowed herself to sit with the question that the journal asked without quite asking. Not what happened to him, because she had made her peace in the way that people must with not knowing, but something else. Something that the journal, in its quiet and unhurried way, had been building toward across 64 handwritten pages. Who was he, really, out there alone? Not Chester Renner the neighbor, the community pillar, the reliable fisherman who never missed a tide, but the man underneath, the one who talked to his dead wife on bad days and watched the light change on the Atlantic in October and wrote, for 3 years in a notebook nobody was supposed to read, about everything that mattered to him and everything that frightened him and everything that he found beautiful about a life lived close to something vast and indifferent and alive. She had not known that man as well as she thought she had. And now she would spend the rest of her life learning him, one page at a time. The investigation into Chester Renner's disappearance remains open. The entry in the Marine Patrol case file is brief and unresolved. It notes the condition of the vessel. It notes the absence of mechanical failure. It notes the unexplained return trajectory of the Hazel Dawn to the cove. It notes the entries in the journal regarding the unidentified trawler and the forwarding of that information to the Coast Guard's Intelligence Division. The file notes that no body was ever recovered. It notes that the investigation yielded no confirmed explanation for the disappearance. And at the bottom of the file, in the space reserved for case status, someone has written 2 words in neat capital letters. Search suspended. If this story moved you, subscribe, share it, and keep watching. Every story we tell is a light on the water for someone who never came home.